Oh, yeah. Hello. Okay, so today I'm going to be reading from the Humble Little Condom, chapters 7 and 8. Okay. 7. Malthus, skins, and dead letters. The West's culture wars. By the end of the 18th century, Europe and America had seen a great number of changes at home and abroad. Captain Cook had made his historic journey from the South Pole. Mozart and Haydn were writing some of history's most important pieces of music. In Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Blake were ushering in a great age for poetry. America had broken free of British control, and the French Revolution had created Europe's first constitutional government. There were also slowly emerging social movements that would eventually introduce radical social changes to Western society. When Mary Wollstonecraft published her feminist treaty, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, she ushered in the long, painful struggle on the part of women to achieve social and economic parity with men. And though the new American Constitution proved to be a great compromise when those who argued that it should reject the institution of slavery lost their battle, the issue did not go away and abolitionism was born. But it was perhaps Malthusian theory that really launched one of the most interesting social movements of the time, one that helped shape modern Western society's approach to human sexuality. Historians of this period often lump together all of the struggles of the late 18th and 19th centuries as the culture wars. Although the English and American wars were fought over different issues, England's began over the rigid social class system and the causes and solutions of poverty, whereas the American battles were fought over the institution of slavery and women's rights. Both countries' struggles had one thing in mind: their skins, gloves, and letters were front and center in the acrimonious debates over their social and political futures. A powerful social movement began in England in 1798 with the publication of a pamphlet titled An Essay on the Principle of Population, authored by ordained priest Thomas Malthus. The short tract hypnotized that as the poor and working classes increased in number, their population would eventually outstrip the available food supply. Malthus had been influenced in his beliefs by both the philosophies of his father, a gentleman of means and an avid armchair philosopher, and his father's philosophical friends, the most important being Swiss socialist philosopher Jean Jacques Rousseau. Unlike the majority of Britons, these men believed that everyone, rich or poor, had the power of reason, no matter what social class or standing. Malthus incorporated this belief into his theory, convinced that even the poor could be convinced that they needed to curb their reproduction for the greater good. Reaction to Malthusian theory was strong and swift. Plenty of American intellectuals like Thomas Jefferson embraced the idea, but because the North American continent appeared to have endless boundaries, fear of too many poor people never got a foothold. Not so in England, however, where the theory resonated for many intellectuals, as well as middle and upper class Britons, who were worried about the sharp increase in the population of British poor at this time. Either way, right or wrong, the Malthusians inadvertently brought about the birth of the first birth control movement, and along with it came the condom. Malthus personally thought that the solution to the looming population and ensuing food shortage crisis was for the lower classes to stop having children. He was not specific about just how to make this happen, except to have the poor use preventative checks. Although Malthus was not very helpful in providing specifics about just how to help the poor stop reproducing, his theory is important to this chapter in condom history. In a roundabout way, he is the father of the modern birth control movement, a movement he would not actually lead, but would foster through his mentoring of the first of the brave men who did work toward making contraception a public matter. It began when Malthusian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, well known in the late 18th and early 19th centuries as an author and social activist, urged his fellow Malthusians to embrace the idea that family size limitation for the poor could only be achieved if they used birth control, a far cry from just expecting abstinence. Although Bentham was not in love with the condom, he condescendingly referred to it as the dead letter. He at least recognized the fact that if the poor were expected to use birth control, they would need to be educated about a variety of easy to use and easy to understand preventatives. Another important voice in the movement was radical journalist and printer Richard Carlisle, best known for his anti government pamphlets urging Parliament to pass much needed social and economic reforms, and his long stays in jail because of them. Carlyle was also pro women's rights. In his 1825 self published tract, Every Woman's Book, or What is Love, Carlyle most heartedly recommended that women use the sponge, modeled after the ancient tampon, a birth control method that had re emerged in France after at least 1,000 year hiatus. But he also talked about the skin or glove as a way in which men could help prevent pregnancy. He counseled, "These are sold in London at brothels, by waiters at taverns, and by some women and girls in the neighborhood of places of resort, such as Westminster Hall." Carlyle's knowledge of the earliest places to buy condoms is notable. He also followed the movements of government officials so closely that he knew many members of parliament were avid users of gloves and that they found it a convenience to buy their supplies on the way to running the country. But Carlyle also complained that skins were artificial because they could deaden sensation and were an interruption. Like the 18th century physicians who preceded him, it is unclear as to whether Carlyle felt this way because of personal experience or presumed it and was worried that the artificiality of condom use meant many working class men would reject using a glove. Either way, although men like Bentham and Carlyle may sound a bit stiff and maybe even prudish, they were extremely courageous for speaking publicly to what was, in many ways, a sexually ignorant nation about how to limit family size, in spite of the fact that the condom had been popular in England probably since the Norman period. Average Englishmen were not well educated regarding their own bodies, and the condom's modern English history was mostly associated with disease prevention. As a publicly advocated birth control device, discussing it was new and sometimes dangerous ground, which opened the Malthusians up to severe public criticism. In one of many reactions to the handbills Carlyle produced and circulated about birth control, one detractor encapsulated the but critical attitudes about sex that were common at the time. If the reader require anything to disgust him with the foregoing filth, let him go herd with wolves and monkeys. He is unfit for human fellowship. Everyone is a critic. Grassroots condoms. The early Malthusians generally used the written word to convince the English poor of the need to practice birth control. They were well meaning, but few of their intended audience could read or write at all. There were, though, some family limitation advocates who understood the true meaning of grassroots campaigning. Earthier and more practical in their efforts to help the poor understand birth control and its connection to alleviating poverty, early 19th century condom adherents also used written tracts to spread the word, but their pamphlets were not lofty lectures on the need to limit population to spare the human race. They instructed the reader on how to make condoms. The receipts were written in the simplest terms, with directions about purchasing animal intestines from a butcher, with assurances that the butcher need not know the purpose of the purchase and how to fashion condoms out of the material. The recipes were distributed in the poorer sections of London and the large northern cities. Whether they had much impact is another issue, but it would have been amusing to see upper class matrons determined to help mankind, handing out illustrated instructions on how to make gloves. God gave us beards. By the 1840s, British newspapers had gotten into the Birth Control Act, boldly carrying ads for condoms and other birth control devices and methods. Probably the most colorful and entertaining of all the advertisements was written by someone who identified himself only as married man with 6 children. In On the Use of Nightcaps, which was written to appear to be a legitimate editorial, married man takes to task the small group of birth control advocates who preached coitus interruptus as the best method. How a gentleman could make a practice in the very moment of unutterable ecstasy of withdrawing from the arena is more than I can conceive. He went on to suggest that the best course of action was to place over the gentleman's gentleman a very fine nightcap, doing little to dull the sensation. The reader was notified that this creative salesman's nightcaps were a simple French invention universally known in France. And he suggested that, though a wife was likely to laugh when she first saw the French letter, why not let her help him try it on? As one who believed in making the condom a part of foreplay, Casanova would have been proud of married man. Let it be tried on, and the experiment would be found not complete without its being tried in at one of the numerous contacts most married people enjoy. This experiment would be interesting from its novelty. The writer then assured his reader that this does not have to be done until the last minute and will not disturb the process, since it takes only a few seconds. Pity the Malthusians did not know this. In his thorough sales pitch, Married Man also tried to reassure the moralists who might condemn condoms on ethical grounds. He mentions the fact that the nightcap cannot be used for seduction, because no virgin could be opened by a gentleman's member with the cap on without its bursting. It is hard enough to imagine a modern newspaper like the Washington Post accepting this kind of explicit advertisement today, but in 1840s England, in his final attempt to cover any and all objections his audience might have had to using a condom, specifically those concerns about the moral rights and wrongs of birth control, our writer makes this marvelous analogy. God gave us beards, but man invented razors. America's Culture Wars. Although America did not suffer the crowding and therefore the population debates of Europe, beginning in the early part of the 19th century, it did have its own battles over social issues. America's culture wars were fought over gender roles, racism and slavery, social economic issues, and sex. One of the loudest voices in the battle over the rights and wrongs of birth control and human sexuality was Scottish born Robert Dale Owen. Owen moved to England as a child, and at the age of 24, he immigrated to America with his father, Robert Owen Sr., who is famous in American history as the founder of New Harmony, a utopian community in Illinois. The younger Owen inherited his activist spirit from his father, who had hoped that by creating a self sustaining community dedicated to cooperation and rational education, he could fix what was wrong with the world. Among his other claims to fame, Owen was also one of the founders of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., served as a member of the House of Representatives, and was a tireless advocate who pushed the federal government to fund public education. But he was also a strong advocate for free and legal birth control. Try something real quick. Owen returned to England regularly in the first few decades of the 19th century, and on one of his trips, he read Carlisle's tract on birth control, bringing at least one copy back to the US. It was the influence of the English activists, especially Carlisle, that led to Owen becoming America's first birth control advocate. As far as the actual methods he favored, Owen believed that coitus interruptus was the safest. But he also talked about the condom or a covering made of very fine, smooth, and delicately prepared skin. His greatest concern was that condoms were not a very clean method and complained that they were inconvenient and expensive, wadrouche being fit for use once only and costing about $1. Owen obviously had not been exposed to the linen or silk condoms still available in his native country, where men still washed and reused their gloves. His methods were assailed by advocates of women's rights as impractical, in fact, downright chauvinistic, giving men all the power when it came to deciding when, if, and what to use. But as with his English counterparts, Owen is best viewed through the lens of his own times. In his final summation of the condom and of birth control in general, and in spite of his prejudices, he felt that the glove was perfectly moral and innocent. And his final answer to women advocates whose objection to the condom was that it put all the control in the hands of men. A woman's ultimate and only effectual defense was to refuse connection with any man void of honor. Simple enough. Joining the ranks of birth control advocates were a handful of medical professionals who spoke publicly about birth control methods, including men like Massachusetts physician Charles Knowlton. Knowlton broke scientific ground when he called contraception a moral right, and he worked hard to educate the general public as to what worked. But Knowlton was against the condom because he felt it was an unhealthy and expensive contraceptive method on account of cleanliness and expense, and by no means calculated to some into general use. Yet, like others, he continued to identify it with disease prevention or syphilitic affections. Although Knowlton is another good example of the activists who believed information about contraception should be readily available to the masses, historically his work is more important as an example of the somewhat schizophrenic public and legal approach to human sexuality that was prevalent in early 19th century America. Many average Americans were desperate for birth control advice, and the open market had been trying to address the need for many decades. Especially in large cities, Americans were becoming more open about sex in general, but what the public wanted was not always reflected in the legal realm, especially when it came to condoms. Charles Knowlton was arrested for indecency and sentenced to 3 months hard labor just for writing about them. This was not his first arrest. The first time Knowlton was sent to prison was for illegal dissection. He had stolen a corpse from a cemetery so that he could study and write about the human body. Sadly, Knowlton's arrest early in the century foreshadowed what would happen more than 4 decades later under the guise of protecting public morality. Sex in the Lyceum. In spite of the sporadic legal prosecutions of birth control advisors, not those who actually made and sold condoms, beginning in the 1820s and continuing until the 1870s, writers and lecturers, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, traveled all over the growing country, speaking to audiences about physiology and all manner of sexual matters, important and highly charged issues of the time, as well as much more benign subjects, found an eager audience in the Lyceum and along the local lecture circuits, especially during the winter months. Urban Americans were desperate for diversion and would happily pay a few cents to hear professionals discuss their fields, as well as to listen to social activists trying to find support for their causes. In this atmosphere, the condom found a cozy niche in lectures about human sexuality. Among the speakers of the day were self styled sex experts who took full advantage of public curiosity and a need to know. The experts were not doctors or scientists, but a motley group of supporters of the women's rights and abolitionist movements, as well as savvy business people. But no matter the motives of the experts, they took full advantage of what St. Mary, America's first condom professional, had noted in his keen observations of Americans and sexuality. And they were, especially women, ignorant of even the fundamentals regarding their own bodies. The popularity of this first wave of public discourses on sex, the human body, and contraception was fueled by the simple desire to understand how individuals could take control of their own reproductive systems. Although many of the ladies expressed a reluctance about being seen entering a half full of others who were sexually curious, desperate, or simply hoping to hear or see something a bit risque, the sex lectures were some of the best attended public entertainments of the antebellum era and continued to be popular until the early 1870s. A number of the lecturers included in their talks specifics on how to prevent pregnancy by using sponges, douches, and condoms. After each lecture, these experts would remain on hand to peddle not only booklets they had written on the subject, but also the devices about which they had lectured. Especially popular with the sex lecturers, probably because of the size and ease of transport, were condoms. Other lecturers were actually professionals in the condom industry, advertising not only their services as traveling sex educators, but also their contraceptive wares. Newspapers and broadsides publicized both, and many of the pros had thriving mail order condom businesses. One of these used a rather unique marketing technique in his mail order business. First, he charged an unbelievable $5 for a box of 3 sheaths, and he required that each order include a written explanation of why the customer needed them. Perhaps this was a marketing tool to help him in his advertising, or maybe he just found the descriptions enjoyable to read. Possibly, the most surprising of the lecture circuit sex experts were the women, especially early feminist and Quaker Mary Gove. Gove chose the unusual itinerant lifestyle after she had found out how difficult it was to earn her own living when she had escaped an unhappy marriage. She fell back on her knowledge of anatomy and physiology, which she had studied extensively, and became genuinely interested in teaching people, especially other women, about their own reproductive systems. She had picked up sufficient knowledge in what was then state of the art scientific theory to speak fairly accurately and at length about many issues pertaining to sex and the human body. With great dignity, Gove would calmly climb the stairs to the dais in front of often huge audiences. In her plain Quaker dress, she reached out to other women with her straightforward speech. Gove often drew shocked gasps when she used, rather than a primitive mannequin, her own fully clothed body to demonstrate her points about the female anatomy. Although she had her critics, even the male dominated medical community commended her efforts to educate women about their own sexuality, including birth control. She became so well known, in fact, that a medical journal wrote about her work, praising it as nothing objectionable or indelicate for one woman to tell another those important facts in a country where ladies have been too negligent of the laws of health, and sometimes apparently proud of being profoundly ignorant of the mechanism of themselves. Among other earthy advice, Gove told men and women about the rhythm method and the use of delicate coverings of the whole penis. At some point, she began to carry a supply of the delicate coverings with her, making a little bit extra on the side. Surprisingly, Elizabeth Blackwell, America's most famous woman doctor, was very critical of Gove and the others who carry the contraceptive message to average Americans, accusing them of spreading doctrines of abortion and prostitution under spiritual and scientific guise. This incorrect condemnation of their profession and purpose, however, did little to slow down the sex experts. Make sure my thing's still plugged in. Mr. Goodyear's rubber and the god of fire. By the late 18th century, Europeans who had traveled throughout South America had been native peoples playing with soft, pliable balls made from the coagulated sap of a variety of native trees. The English discovered that bits of the soft substance, alternatively called gutta percha and Indian rubber, but mostly referred to just as rubber, could erase pencil marks. Beyond that, although both American and British manufacturers tried to turn the substance into practical items like waterproof clothing, rubber just did not stand up to changes in temperature. It took a determined and eccentric young American inventor to revolutionize its production. Charles Goodyear was obsessed with rubber and spent years and all his money trying to find a way to stabilize it. Although a flexible, waterproof material, rubber was unstable, going brittle in cold weather and turning into a smelly, gelatinous mess in the heat. When manufacturers, including Goodyear, used it to produce umbrellas, boots, and other consumer goods, they found that rubber simply could not be used to make long-wearing products. Customers returned the items, disgusted with the shoddy goods that had been passed off as waterproof. But after years of experiments that actually bankrupted his family, Charles Goodyear finally realized his dream. He discovered, quite by accident, how to stabilize the sap. He was so obsessed with and received his first patent for vulcanizing from the Vulcan, the Roman god of fire, rubber in 1837. Vulcanization is the process of treating crude rubber with sulfur and intense heat, which turns it into a strong elastic material, impervious to heat or cold. The newly developed material created a stronger, more elastic, and far more durable rubber material with the potential of making all kinds of products, including condoms. It took about 20 years for the rubber industry to establish itself as a major player in the growing world of manufacturing. But by the late 1850s, firms like Goodyear, named after but not owned by Charles Goodyear, B.F. Goodrich, and Hancock, were household names. And long before the production of tires, they were all making diagrams, dildos, really, and condoms. Although it stretches the imagination to envision proper ladies, dressed as if straight out of Gaudi's, going to the local hardware or general store, deciding on which dildo to purchase or which brand of rubber was best, it happened. Others preferred to order through the mail. Even the name of the basic material became an international euphemism for the condom. By the end of the 19th century, the English, Americans, Australians, South Americans, and many others referred to using a rubber. The nickname Goodyear himself was supposed to have given the vulcanized device. The first rubbers reassembled. The first rubbers resembled an industrial version of Fallopio's linen sheath. They were meant to fit over only the top of the penis, which meant greater sensitivity. The early caps had to be measured to the individual user and custom made, meaning a trip to the doctor for fitting, which limited their popularity. They also tended to fall off at crucial moments. In answer to these concerns, it did not take long for the manufacturers to design a full-length rubber These were available in pharmacies, one size fits all. British manufacturers were the first to offer three different sizes. But how comfortable were rubbers? The boasts of some manufacturers that their brands would last for a lifetime, as long as the wearer washed and dried his cap after each use, is evidence of not just durability, but of how tough and uncomfortable early rubbers must have been. Even by the 20th century, one rubber was often touted as being all a man would ever have to purchase. Washing and drying were still the standard directive, with the added advice that slathering the condom with lots of Vaseline before putting it away would add years to its life. And also Casanova and Boswell sometimes complained about being shut up in a dead skin. They would have hated rubbers. Their armor, made of animal bladder, was far more delicate. At least rubbers came in their own little leather boxes. Though rubber sales steadily rose as the century wore on, Vulcan's condom, cap, or rubber was never as popular as the skin variety. Skins and gloves continued to be manufactured at home and by individual entrepreneurs, and were favored for their cost effectiveness and their greater sensitivity. There were also very high quality varieties available. A package of good quality fish bladder, membranous envelopes, was available for as little as $5 a dozen, still out of the average man's price range. The very best continued to be imported from Paris and Venice, most commonly smuggled in by sea captains and small importers who did not want to pay the customs agents the high taxes condoms fetched. Guts versus rubbers. In the 19th century, in spite of the invention of rubber condoms, which were commonly available by the 1850s, most manufacturers made their products from animal intestines, imported from the large and well established European meat processors. In fact, even after the American Civil War, U.S. manufacturers bought ever increasing amounts of intestines from European sausage provisioners yearly. By the 1870s, they were spending over $45,000 a year on lamb, sheep, and cow intestines. The reason for the need to import so much was that prior to the 1870s, there were no refrigerated rail cars, and meat products were locally prepared. The sausage making and intestine preparing trade was very slow to develop. A ready supply of bulk condom making materials was not always available. Plus, the Europeans had had professional bouche manufacturers for centuries, and there were still many in the meat trade who prepared quantities of high grade material for those not intending to make sausage. This does not mean, however, that local American butchers did not play a role, because the condom never achieved, nor will it, a comfortable place in people's daily speech. Customers who wanted to produce their own sheaths would ask the butcher for cow or sheep intestines, carefully explaining they were making homemade sausages. As in England, by the 1840s, recipes for making condoms were being widely circulated in the big cities, begun by anonymous birth control advocates in Philadelphia, then spreading to small towns and throughout farming communities along the eastern seaboard. Do not forget your French letters. In 1840s America, professionally made condoms were available in a variety of styles, and the desired quality dictated the manufacturing process, a throwback from early condom making. The most expensive on the market were gold beaters, inferring a inferring a very fine texture and fit. The untreated intestinal material was put through a lengthy series of chemical processes, expertly molded and smothered with oil. The cheapest, and those made at home, were slices of dried intestine, glued or sewn together and tied at the top with a ribbon or a piece of scrap fabric. The popularity of skins and rubbers, commercially made, imported, or homemade, continued to grow during and immediately following the Civil War. Here again, there is a historical switch that takes place regarding why men wore condoms. From the late 18th century until the war, the condom had been talked about, condemned, and lauded as a birth control device. But during and after the 1860s, partly because of the displacement of so many men from their homes and communities, partly because of the impoverishment of so many young women left without the support of their men and with no promise of real jobs or decent employment, and because of the dramatic population shift to the cities, there was a huge increase in prostitution during this period. The clap and the pox re-emerged as public health threats, and some men once again became concerned with protecting themselves and used rubbers, gloves, and French letters to avoid infection. Even in New York, even the New York Times got into the Condom Act. It was the first major American newspaper to print an advertisement for the little items until the 1980s. No single publication of a condom ad had the exposure the 1861 Dr. Powers's French Preventatives did. In fact, condoms were so readily available by then that the costs had dropped to a mere dime apiece, $1.60 today, adjusting for inflation. Read that paragraph again because it shocked me. Even the New York Times got into the Condom Act. It was the first major American newspaper to print an advertisement for the little items. Until the 1980s, no single publication of a condom ad had the exposure the 1861 Dr. Powers French Preventatives did. In fact, condoms were so readily available by then that the cost had dropped to a mere dime apiece, $1.60 today, adjusting for inflation. Cultural conflict and the condom. Partly because of the increasing access to contraceptives as the 19th century progressed, the condom's role in the struggle over morality versus practicality in human sexuality was well established. On the one hand, men had been using the device to prevent disease and pregnancy for thousands of years. On the other hand, the 19th century experienced extreme social and religious movements, backlashes against changing social and economic dynamics, and frustrations over the old social and economic order, specifically women's rights and slavery. Industry, profit, and urbanization were overtaking the rural, traditional way of life. As this happened, procreation became, for some, a symbol of the old traditions. For those fearful of the rapid changes taking place, birth control increasingly became a symbol of immoral, loose behaviors and represented what was wrong with modern American society. For the next 150 years, the life of the condom reflected the ups and downs of the American psyche. Some observers will read these ups and downs as reflective of a certain or continued cultural hypocrisy, in spite of the creeping conservatism taking hold by the mid 19th century. Though rubber condoms went mainstream, making millions of dollars for manufacturers. and skins continued to be produced in greater and greater numbers. They were here to stay, but not without a fight. Chapter 8: A one-man fight against the condom, the American Civil War, and Comstockery. The American Civil War certainly helped shape the last quarter of the 19th century, leaving the southern portion of the nation so impoverished that it took more than 100 years to recover. But for the rest of the nation, this era was one of the most dynamic in U.S. history, issuing in changes, great and small, that would alter the course of American and even world history. In 1861, Yale University awarded the first ever American doctorate of philosophy, and that same year, the telegraph rendered the beloved Pony Express obsolete. Northerners could spend their newly federally backed paper money with peace of mind, and people living in the big cities enjoyed having their mail delivered to their homes. At the close of the war, Samuel Clemens, writing as Mark Twain, was well established in the hearts and minds of American readers. Horatio Alger was doing a brisk business with his rags to riches novels, and Louisa May Alcott wrote what would become one of the most recognized classic novels in American history, Little Women. More dramatically, the United States began a crash course in international imperialism by taking pieces of the South Pacific and Asia under its wing, actions that reverberated throughout the world. As early as 1865, however, some Americans were disturbed by the massive changes the Civil War and continuing industrialization had wrought upon the culture, upon the country. As early as 1865, however, some Americans were disturbed by the massive changes the Civil War and continuing industrialization had wrought upon the country, not just physically and politically, but socially as well. The mass migration to the cities continued at breakneck speed throughout the rest of the century and fueled an already established fear, the fear that the moral character of the nation was at risk. Cities, after all, bred moral as well as fiscal corruption. This new mood led to some astounding events and had a huge impact on the condom. Like militaries before them, along with food, water, munitions, and the other necessities in their rucksacks, Union and Confederate soldiers also carried their French letters, sheaths, and gloves. There were also the major market share for the booming new market in pornographic photographs and novels ordered through New York based catalogs, the same source many military men used to buy their condoms. But this easy sexual trade was not necessarily reflected on the attitudes of all Americans at the close of the war in a backlash against the growing porn trade, specifically the mail order kind. Congress was under some public pressure to pass an obscenity law intended to prevent smutty materials from being sent through the mail. At the same time, federal bureaucrats were trying to actually define just what the word obscenity meant. Into this odd mix of sex in the marketplace and concerns over the moral fiber of the nation stumbled an unlikely crusader. Social vice and national decay were to each other as parent and child. Who was Anthony Comstock? Anthony Comstock, an unemployed former Union soldier, looms large in the remarkable history of the condom, a self-styled moralist who could not seem to find his professional niche in life. Comstock ended up at the center of a controversial law that plagued condom manufacturers well into the 20th century, as well as anyone who sought, talked, wrote about, or provided information relating to human sexuality. He also played a central role in making contraception and venereal disease prevention illegal in the United States. But where did a nobody like Comstock, a man with little education or profession, manage to secure such power? Some might argue it was his tenacity and absolute commitment to what he felt was right, a morally driven fire in his belly that made him that led him to power. But perhaps it was simply serendipity. Had some of New York's most powerful businessmen not been behind him, Comstock would probably at best be a historical footnote alongside the other fanatics and do-gooders who, at different intervals in history, have tried to rid society of its sins. It is certainly true that the history of the humble condom would have been a very different one without him. Comstock was a devout Congregationalist from Connecticut who, during his short stint as a Union soldier, offered his fellow soldiers, when he slowly and deliberately poured his daily ration of whiskey onto the ground, illustrating his disgust with all things sinful. The soldiers were less concerned with his theatrics than with his wastefulness. But early on, Comstock had a flair for the melodramatic, a flair he employed in his crusade against sin. After the war, a restless and unemployed Comstock moved to New York City, shifting from one low level job to the next. But it was being forced to live in a poor boarding house near the Tenderloin district, a haven for prostitutes and pimps, that pushed Comstock from being just a discontented prude to a public activist. He was so shocked at what he saw on the streets, he became obsessed with cleaning it up. There is no doubt that the Tenderloin was one of the most notorious neighborhoods in New York, and by the 1840s, New York itself had been dubbed the Gomorrah of the New World. In and around the streets, Comstock walked where theaters had nude models acting out famous paintings. Prostitutes offered something for everyone, and street vendors peddled smutty photographs, racy newspapers, pornographic books, and plenty of condoms. Someone as obsessed with public morality as Comstock would have been stunned by this open sex market. Shocked or not, though, Comstock was up for the challenge, and not long after taking up residence in a lowly boarding house, he began his career as a moral crusader, trolling the streets and alleyways in search of sin. When he found sin, but when he found sin but could not get the New York Police Department interested in arresting prostitutes and condom traders, he decided it was his civic duty to do the job for them. He hit the streets and began making citizens' arrests, playing the part of a kooky eccentric and brandishing his umbrella in the air while chasing after surprised prostitutes was a far cry, though, from becoming the man responsible for sweeping social legislation. But it was this unorthodox behavior that brought him to the attention of a wealthy New York businessman and launched his moral crusade. Hearing about Comstock's one-man police force, Morris Jessup, also a Congregationalist, originally from Connecticut, contacted Comstock. What Jessup saw when they met was a tall, imposing figure with mutton chop sideburns and an unflinching gaze. He liked what he saw, and after that, the future success of Comstockery was pretty much assured. Jessup got together a group of his fellow wealthy industrialists who were all in agreement that America was fast becoming a sinful flesh pot, and they formed an offshoot of the YMCA, the NYCSV, or the New York Committee for the Suppression of Vice. Similar agencies were popping up all over the country, backed by purity crusaders who were often people of wealth. Wealth derived from the urban expansion, social changes, and the working classes the crusaders so feared. People like Samuel Colgate, the great soap giant, and J. Pierpont Morgan, copper magnate and financier, were all behind the purity movement and behind Anthony Comstock. After its creation, it did not take much effort for Comstock to get himself hired as the NYCSV's secretary, accompanied by a handsome salary that must have been very appealing to a man who had no profession or skills. Comstock loved his new job. With the help of this handful of wealthier, ultra conservative New York businessmen determined to make America moral again, Comstock also managed to make the most out of their political strengths. Morgan and others influenced some powerful Washington legislators in the 42nd Congress to pass legislation that would, little did they know, deeply influence the nature of American sexuality. The Comstock Act, as this legislation came to be called, was actually one small section of a mass postal bill, initially meant to target mail order pornographers, something the earlier law was intended to achieve and had not. But it ended up to be a much more sweeping bill, outlawing any article of an immoral nature, or any drug or medicine, or any article whatever for the prevention of conception. In spite of the power of Comstock and his backers, in spite of the power Comstock and his backers yielded, it was again good luck that assured the passing of the Comstock Act. The 42nd Congress was one of the most corrupting in American history, and on the eve of President Grant's inauguration in March 1873, this Congress found itself under pressure to actually legislate. In the wee hours of the morning of March 3rd, they passed hundreds of bills, most unread by the congressmen voting for them. The postal bill was just one of the many that were pushed through that morning. After its passage, Comstock used his powerful friends to get himself appointed as special agent of the U.S. Post Office, the agency empowered through the new legislation to prevent obscene materials from being mailed. Under the guise of the Comstock Act, Section 211 of the Federal Criminal Code, he stretched his power to personally harass anyone who had anything to do with teaching about contraception, selling or producing birth control devices, or even discussing sex. From 1873 until just before his death in 1915, Comstock used the act to arrest 3,873 people. More than 2,900 were convicted. Comstock was passionate about his job, wielding his authority against anyone he knew was immoral or indecent. But he had an especially active dislike of condoms, condom manufacturers, and booklets about birth control. He was so anti condom that raiding the homes and factories of manufacturers, specifically those based in New York City, became an obsession. He was not shy about throwing the book at anyone who had an interest in them, the penalty for being caught Talking about, writing about, selling, or producing condoms was prison and up to a $600 fine. It was difficult to envision this man who was so dismayed by vice, employing the tactics he did in order to achieve his ends. Besides his standard raids and harassment, Comstock also did things like pay prostitutes to walk past him in a nude so that he could arrest them. Perhaps Comstock had a few sexual proclivities of his own, since walking around naked had nothing to do with the male or with contraception, but his actions illustrate the ways in which Comstock abused his powers by using entrapment, a trick he employed regularly. Whatever it was that was going on in his psyche, the Congregationalist, who once told a magazine reporter that he felt, "You must hunt these men, and apparently women, as you hunt rats without mercy," helped fashion not a morally refreshed nation, but extended a long era of increased sexual hypocrisy, where the laws and the formal mores of American society did not mesh with private practice. But Comstock never relented in his obsessive moral quest, even in his seniority. Not long before his death, he was asked by a reporter from Harper's Weekly why he had included condoms uh, and other contraceptives in a pornographic law. After all, his interviewer pointed out, the European scientific community had long ago agreed that they were important to public health. Comstock answered stubbornly, "If you open the door to anything, the filth will all pour in and the degradation of youth will follow." Did Comstock kill the rubber? Although many arrests were made under Section 211, most, over 50%, were in New York City and in the immediate area. As it turned out, there were far too few postal agents to be able to police the entire country, which helps explain the underground sex and birth control trade that actually flourished under Comstock's watchful eye. Although many arrests were made under Section 211, most, over 50%, were in New York City and the immediate area. As it turned out, there were far too few postal agents to be able to police the entire country, which helps explain the underground sex and birth control trade that actually flourished under Comstock's watchful eye. Although there was risk involved, small manufacturers continued to produce and sell condoms, as well as other contraceptives. They simply changed their tactics. In discreet ads, the condom and the French letter became the cap, sheath, capote, pouch, nail shield, or simply the rubber good. The best continued to be imported from Europe, smuggled in just as they had been 100 years before. At the turn of the 20th century, one enterprising inventor from Texas even received a patent on his version of a pouch and was honest on his patent application when he described his invention as something to catch and retain all discharges coming from the male member. Amazingly, many condom sellers remained in business and even flourished. In spite of the legal consequences if they were caught, small entrepreneurs went where the larger rubber manufacturers could not go, creating tiny condom factories, usually in their homes. These businesses continue to provide condoms to Americans despite for birth control and to a lesser extent disease prevention. They were careful to keep their stocks well hidden, and though it is impossible to figure out just who sold how many to whom, even European travelers traversing the country during the last quarter of the 19th century commented in letters home about the fact that every little village seemed to have contraceptive wares available. Also interesting is the fact that some of Comstock's fellow NYCSV members and early backers actually manufactured contraceptives. Samuel Colgate's soap company sold Vaseline, and right after the passage of the Comstock Act, Colgate began a huge advertising campaign touting his petroleum jelly mixed with a little salicylic acid as a safe contraceptive method. Safe, yes. Contraceptive, no. Goodyear, Goodrich, and Sears and Roebuck also advertised their contraceptive products in their own and others' catalogs. None of the major producers, however, were ever prosecuted. Comstock went after the little guys only, but they could be hard to catch. Some of the big producers like Goodyear and other rubber manufacturers did remain nominally in the condom making business legally, though not at the pre Comstock level. The major producers of rubbers took advantage of a loophole in the Comstock Act that allowed doctors to prescribe condoms for medical purposes. Any extras the rubber makers found themselves with were quietly sold to the same pharmacies that dispensed the legal condoms, as well as retailers who were not actually pharmacists but druggist suppliers. Typically, these retailers simply placed the items in the rear of the stores or behind the counter. Word of mouth led customers into the condom outlets, where they would request their rubber goods, pay their bills, and exit with a small brown package under their arms. On the rare occasion that the law did catch up with mass produced rubbers, it was the small retailer who purchased and sold only small job lots who took the heat. None of the big boys like Goodyear and Goodrich were charged or fined or prevented from making their medicinal condoms. Their political connections and the lobbying power worked not only to keep them in the business, but also made sure no small timers ever gained a foothold in the lucrative medicinal market. No matter who was and who was not caught, the condom industry thrived through both mail order and bricks and mortar retail, as well as backdoor sales. Those who sold them via the mail were vulnerable because that is where Comstock's postal agents were most likely to catch them. But these distributors were all over the country and usually managed to elude the law or get away with minor fines. They were also remarkably resilient and creative in the way they advertised and concealed their own identities. Condom advertising pseudonyms included terms like Comstock Capotes, making clever use of the fanatic anti sex crusader's name to identify a birth control device. The advertisers themselves were careful to use creative titles when they advertised their goods and services in the circulars, newspapers, and penny pamphlets that could be found on any street corner in cities and towns. Especially popular with women and men selling their wares was the title Madame. And the quantities many of the condom dealers dealt in was staggering. When German immigrant Joseph Bachrach, who both produced and sold them, was caught by a Comstock agent, he had more than 11,000 caps and condoms in stock. After Bachrach paid his fine, he went right back to business. It is not possible to know who produced their own and who were middlemen for producers or importers. It is certain that European animal intestines remain the most popular material for the manufacture of high quality skin condoms after 1870, between $35,000 and $50,000 a year was still being spent importing intestines into the United States for condom production. It is not possible to know who produced their own and who were middlemen for producers or importers. It is certain that European animal intestines remain the most popular material for the manufacture of high quality skin condoms after 1870, between $35,000 and $50,000 a year was still being spent importing intestines into the United States for condom production. Classes of women. Although Comstock had driven the sex experts underground, he was not able to slow the unsinkable Mrs. Dr. Sarah Chase from continuing in the fine tradition of sex lecturers at the Lyceum, or from providing one-on-one services to women, including educating about condom use and even performing abortions. Chase was the Comstock's era's most successful condom saleswoman. However, she was more than just a peddler. She was definitely of the spirit of her earlier counterpart, the Quaker sex lecturer Mary Gove. Chase was a bona fide homeopath and a card carrying feminist who gave lectures on the public circuit and at New York City's Copper Union Academy from the 1870s into the 20th century. Like Gove, she sold contraceptives after each of her lectures, but Gove had not had to deal with the likes of Anthony Comstock. When he discovered Chase was not only teaching about contraception, but also selling condoms and other contraceptives after her speeches and through the mail, he was sure he had found his latest victim. In spite of her activities, which included at least 5 arrests, Chase was one of those who Comstock could not get a judge or jury to convict. This was in spite of his attempt to illegally indict Chase, an effort that prompted her to file a $10,000 lawsuit against him, claiming false arrest. Like others Comstock harassed, Sarah Chase managed to continue in the condom business for many years and numbered as one of Comstock's bitterest failures. The hundreds, possibly thousands of women entrepreneurs in the condom business, all happily defying Comstock, were in it for the money. By the end of the 19th century, however, there were new faces in the battles over condom use, and they had nothing to do with production and sales. Birth control, a new phrase coined by America's most public birth control advocate, had become a part of the growing feminist agenda. And along with the struggle to get the right to vote, many feminists believed equality could not be achieved without the legal ability, to control the number of children women had. And it is here that feminists and the condom often clashed. Some early feminists approved of and even promoted its use as a simple and expensive way to prevent pregnancy. However, as the century moved forward and the feminist movement matured, more and more of its leaders reversed that stance and became very anti condom. They equated its use with the substandard rights of women. Another example of something controlled by and decided upon by men, leaving women out of the decision making process. Feminists preferred the diagram and spermicidal uses because those methods were strictly controlled by women. Enter Margaret Sanger. Let me take it. Enter Margaret Sanger, America's premier birth control pioneer, had mixed emotions about the condom. Margaret Sanger had begun her career as a birth control advocate while working as a nurse in New York City. Appalled at the living conditions of poor immigrant women in neighborhoods like the Tenderloin and Hell's Kitchen, she believed that the already terrible conditions in those areas of the city were made worse by having too many children. Sanger wrote treatises on the subject of birth control, including using condoms, and it was her attempt to send her tracts through the mail that got her into trouble with Comstock, who managed to put her in jail more than once during her long career as an activist. Twice, Sanger narrowly escaped Comstock's attempts to arrest her by escaping to Europe, where she learned more about birth control methods. While there, she increasingly adopted the European feminists' point of view, coming to believe, as they did, that the condom took control away from women, and she became concerned from a practical point of view that they did not offer the kind of protection she felt women deserved. Eventually, Sanger returned to open a birth control clinic in New York, modeled after that of Dutch doctor Aletta Jacobs. Shortly after opening her doors, however, Sanger was snagged again by Comstock, who shut down her efforts as obscene. Ironically, after numerous setbacks due to Comstock's efforts to prevent her from educating poor women about birth control, it was during Sanger's last trial, actually her husband's, who had been arrested for trying to help the cause, that Comstock was finally taken out of the fight. While testifying during the 1915 trial, Comstock, now in his 70s, caught a chill in the drafty courtroom and died from complications soon after. At that point, Comstockery had been in its death throes for some time, helped by determined advocates like Sanger and the tidal wave of people who simply wanted to practice birth control, and an increasingly cynical public who, by the turn of the century, thought Comstock was a little more than annoying. Throwback to the misplaced morality movement of an earlier time. Although the condom had been a device traditionally used by middle-class white Americans, with the help of advocates like Sanger, immigrants who had not known about or had not had access to birth control were increasingly using many methods, including the condom. In addition, by the 1890s, it had also gained great favor among urban African Americans, with mail order businesses advertising French mail safes and rubber articles in popular African American magazines and newspapers. Even W.E.B. Du Bois favored the use of contraceptives as a way to control family size, which he believed promoted quality of life for the black family. Out with the old and in with the new. Americans and Comstock's condom legacy. Out with the old and in with the new. Americans and Comstock's condom legacy. By 1900, Anthony Comstock had confiscated 64,836 articles for immoral use of rubber, etc. His dedication may have pushed condom sales underground, but with or without him, the trade continued to flourish. The portability and profitability promoted their popularity as the industry thrived in a kind of microeconomy. Rubber and skin condoms could be produced in the home or tiny makeshift factories with little expense, unskilled labor, and nominal equipment. The fact That fact also means that it is impossible to know how many condoms were being made, bought, sold, and used at this time. Exact numbers do not become available until the mass production of latex condoms in the 1920s, when the condom went to Wall Street. But there is no doubt that condoms everywhere. But there is no doubt that condoms were everywhere. The Horatio Alger of condoms, portrait of a condom tycoon, born to impoverished parents in southern Germany in 1865, Julius Schmidt began life with multiple challenges. He was born with a severely deformed leg, and he was Jewish. But in his late teens, and with the help of his grandfather, who was convinced American streets were paved with gold, Schmidt raised enough money for passage to New York. His ship docked in New York Harbor in 1882, and he arrived with nothing but his clothes and faith that he would succeed. But poor Schmidt, instead of a magical world and instant wealth, he found himself in a crowded, dirty, and dangerous city, just another desperate immigrant. He also realized what so many who had come before him had. It was tough to make it in the New World. Unable to find work, Schmidt had to sell his extra clothes in order to eat. But just as he was giving into fear and desperation, he landed a job cleaning animal intestines in a sausage casing factory. And like the sausage makers and slaughterhouse workers of old, while performing this unpleasant job, the new German immigrant figured out the other use for the leftover bits of intestine. It was his job to clean. Julius Schmidt started his condom making business in his home and then expanded by peddling his wares in the Tenderloin district, Comstock's original stomping ground, where brothels did a booming business and customers were happy to pay for the convenience. Unfortunately for Schmidt, the Comstock Act of 1872 made his trade illegal. In 1890, it was Anthony Comstock himself who raided Schmidt's home on Manhattan's 46th Street, where he found almost 700 articles to prevent contraception, along with the materials to make more. It was a sad sight to see the menacing Comstock, so tall and stout, pushing the diminutive Schmidt, who had to walk with crutches, out into the horse-drawn paddy wagon. Schmidt was arrested and had to be bailed out of jail. He also had to pay a $50 fine, a surprisingly low amount considering his heinous crime. But he was doing very well with his business, and Schmidt was not going to let a little bump in the condom road stop him from pursuing his life's work, the pursuit of wealth. Although many of the city's condoms came from Europe, they were expensive. Schmidt had realized early on that men and women like himself were providing skins to those who could not afford the more expensive European brands. Schmidt never let Comstock stop him from making and selling condoms, and he continued to prosper, eventually naming his business Julius Schmidt Incorporated. He dropped the T, believing it made him appear less Jewish. He did so well, in fact, that he could afford to get married. American Elizabeth Wolfe became Mrs. Schmidt in 1892. She already had two sons, and she and Julius had two more boys by 1898. When they were older, both Carl and Julius Schmidt Jr. were instrumental in helping their father's business prosper well into the 20th century. Of course, even as the 20th century dawned, the dissemination of anything contraceptive, whether it was how to's or devices, was still illegal. So Schmidt, along with many others, continued to be an underground producer of illegal contraband. He was so mindful of the need to keep his business a secret. Schmidt stated on the 1900 national census that he was a cap manufacturer, a cute play on words since cap was the common term for a bottle stopper, but was also a post-Civil War euphemism for the condom. By the time it was legal to produce condoms, Schmidt had branched out into the rubber business and made a wide variety of rubber based products. His advanced manufacturing methods had been developed in Germany, and the Schmidts were the first in the US to use them. Also, a first, Schmidt genuinely believed his condoms were the best quality available, and he proved it by having them tested. Remember the little problem with holes? He charged more for his brands, but wanted his producers to be the finest on the market, guaranteeing his were free from defects. He had come a long way from the early days. Fortunately for Julius and the other condom manufacturers who, by World War I, were coming out of the condom closet. Though it was still illegal to produce them, the Comstock Act was fading and was finally revoked by the end of World War I. Better yet, at least from Schmidt's perspective, Germany had been Europe's number one supplier of condoms prior to 1914, but war had virtually isolated Germany from the European economy, effectually stopping German export. Schmidt had foreseen this possibility and had positioned himself to become the number one American exporter of condoms to the Allies, thus making an already successful entrepreneur a very rich man indeed. In 1932, Schmidt returned to his native Germany and purchased a German state-of-the-art rubber-making manufacturing plant. Rather than try to run the plant from a distance, he made the decision to dismantle it and shipped all of the equipment to New Jersey, reopening the German plant in the United States. As a Jew, his timing showed an amazing prescience. He barely missed Kristallnacht and the beginning of the Nazi destruction of all Jewish-owned businesses. Despite the depression, Despite the depression, Schmidt's company remained incredibly profitable, and he died a very, very rich man with a condom business that spanned the entire globe. His leading brands, Sheiks and Ramses, remained on the shelves until the late 1990s. Julius Schmidt was not the only immigrant who thrived in the shadowy world of condom production. The fact that the major rubber manufacturers did not take the chance of making condoms their primary business and could not have, since the skin condom remained the most popular type until the invention of latex, left a huge market open to those who were not welcome or even allowed into mainstream American businesses. A disproportionate number of condom manufacturers and salesmen were women, Jews, and immigrants, proving that little had really changed in this ancient business. They found an excellent niche for their legal products. They found an excellent niche for their legal products and profited from the displaced prejudice, a prejudice especially evident in Anthony Comstock and his ilk. Confusion, Comstockery, and the courts. Although it would take another 20 years to be overturned, the Comstock Act had lost a lot of its impact by the end of the 19th century. Sarah Chase's case was just one of many illustrating the fact that there were many judges and jurors, juries who felt Comstock was not just eccentric in his efforts to bring the law to bear against sinners. They hated his courtroom histrionics and were they hated his courtroom histrionics. Read that again. Confusion, Comstockery, and the courts. Although it would take another 20 years to be overturned, the Comstock Act had lost a lot of its impact by the end of the 19th century. Sarah Chase's case was just one of many illustrating the fact that there were many judges and juries who felt Comstock was not just eccentric in his efforts to bring the law to bear against its sinners. They hated his courtroom histrionics and were deeply concerned about the illegal tactics, entrapment, Comstock and his men so commonly used to root out condom merchants, as well as other birth control providers. There were also a number of Supreme Court decisions that held that mail was a private matter protected under the First and Fourth Amendments of the Constitution. These set limits on the number of the tactics Comstock could employ to catch and prosecute mail order condom businesses. Even President Grant, who had entered into the presidency on the eve of the passing of the Comstock Act, ended up pardoning a number of those arrested and convicted under it. Most of them were condom dealers, following Grant's lead. President Hayes also pardoned one of Comstock's victims. Ezra Haywood was a freethinker who had made fun of Comstock's efforts in a poetic reflection on marriage, which got him arrested and sentenced to hard labor for his puns. He was freed by Hayes, who agreed with some judges and former President Grant. Comstock had simply gone too far. But what really helped the condom market going and growing throughout this confused century? It was not court decisions and presidential pardons. It was the daily reality of men and women who simply needed or wanted to control their own destinies by controlling their own reproduction. In spite of the fact, though, Comstock did have an impact on American society. His efforts drove the fledgling movement for public discussion of sex underground. Individuals continued to try to dictate their own sexual destinies. But the late 19th and early 20th centuries are remembered for their odd combination of sexual experimentation, inhibition, and ignorance. Possibly the most dramatic and painful legacy of that ignorance is that as the second half of the 19th century progressed, the incidence of venereal infection skyrocketed. Although the pox and the clap had long been a problem in places like late 18th century Philadelphia, it was not until the latter half of the century that the spread of disease became an enormous, mostly silent, and untreated health problem, especially in the cities. The 19th century condom was a birth control device, and its use as a disease preventative was limited. And though the oldest profession continued to thrive in cities and towns around the country, there was a code of silence that had been stamped onto the American sexual psyche by Comstockery. Those who participated in prostitution simply took their chances. This ignorance had a powerful impact on Americans, and it would take a terrible toll after the turn of the century, especially when the nation entered into the Great War.